Good afternoon or morning, whenever you have decided to look at this. This is our last lecture in our discussion of World War II, and this is going to talk about the Pacific theater of the war and also the end of World War II. So, as usual, make sure you are following along and answering the questions on the left hand side of your note sheet. So we start off with the Bataan Death March. If you remember from our first lecture, when Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, they also bomb the Philippines and as well as the Dutch East Indies. So what the Bataan Death March was is an event where General Douglas MacArthur and his American and Filipino forces are defending the Philippines. They were overrun by the Japanese, and MacArthur ends up surrendering 75,000 of his own men. But he proclaims that he will return eventually. So if you look at the bottom of this map, where the coastline is sort of where the march started, and the route that the soldiers took. The troops that surrendered were forced to march 90 miles away. Thousands die on the way in the form of starvation, disease, or they were actually killed by the Japanese forces. If you were unable to keep up with the rest of the soldiers, they would execute you on the side of the road. This is a quote. Some of the soldiers were executed with what are the equivalent to samurai swords. The next event in our study of the Pacific War is the Doolittle Raid. If any of you guys have seen Pearl Harbor, sort of the last 30 minutes or so are focused on this Doolittle Raid, which is the one of the only bombing missions to hit Tokyo during World War II. And it was also the only mission where American planes were launched from aircraft carriers. It was the longest mission ever flown by an American B-25. It's playing at the top right corner. The Doolittle Raid had two major goals. First one was to boost American morale after Pearl Harbor, and also to expose Japanese vulnerability to attack. Moving on to the Battle of Midway, which is the turning point in the Pacific Theater. This is a turning point because it's the first time the Japanese were stopped by American and Allied forces. The damage inflicted on the Japanese Navy was permanent and significant. This is a picture of the Battle of Midway from above. Remember, the U.S. economy switched from a consumer based economy to a military based economy where all of the goods and services produced during World War II were created to help the war effort. That means the American military was able to produce a lot of weapons, a lot of tanks, ships, things like that. This is important because when the Navy gets like sinks one of their ships, they're able to sort of bring in more ships faster and at a higher rate than the Japanese Navy. Because remember, Japan has a oil and steel embargo, so it's going to be a little more difficult for them to build more ships as quickly as the Americans are able to. During the Pacific Theater of War, the main strategy for the Allies was this idea of island hopping. And it was basically the military would hop to different islands in the Pacific, and eventually they would be within striking distance of Japan. The first island is Guadalcanal. Next one is Cape Gloucester, Battle of Peleliu, Philippines, when the Americans retook the Philippines. MacArthur returns in October of 1944, and that's during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This is also the first time the Japanese used kamikaze pilots. Kamikaze pilots are pilots who load up their planes full of bombs and crash them into American ships. And the effect this had on American soldiers was pretty significant. If you could imagine being on a plane, or not being on a plane, being on a ship, and you're fighting against somebody who was willing to kill themselves to defeat you. It's pretty demoralizing for the American military. But Douglas returns and liberates the Allied POWs who participated in the Bataan Death March. This is a picture of a Japanese soldier who hid in the Philippines, in the jungles of the Philippines, for 3 decades, 30 years. Um, and he refused to believe that the Japanese lost World War II, and even that the war had ended. He had lived and survived in the jungle by stealing food from local farmers and gathering everything else. The next island, the military hop to, was Iwo Jima, and then Okinawa. Iwo Jima and Okinawa were probably two of the most important islands for the American military to capture because these were the closest islands to Japan, and the people who lived on these islands were primarily Japanese speaking people. They weren't necessarily Japanese, but they Japanese was the primary language that was spoken, and this is also the first time that the Americans fly their flag in Japanese territory. This is best represented in this picture on the right hand side, which is actually a staged picture. The photographer, Joe Rosenthal, saw soldiers lifting up the flag, but he missed the photo opportunity, so he asked these Marines to retake the image or reenact the image. A few of the soldiers in the picture were kind of instant celebrities, so to speak. They got to leave the war early, and they sort of traveled around the country selling war bonds and giving and doing reenactments. One of the most shocking part of the Battle of Okinawa was the idea that the Okinawans would rather die or kill themselves than be captured by the American military. There was a spot in Okinawa where these people would just jump off these cliffs because they were so afraid that the American military was going to come and torture them. And this was sort of the mindset that the Japanese military impressed upon the Okinawans in during World War II. Moving on to the USS Indianapolis. This is a ship that was crucial to bringing the parts for what would become the atomic bomb. But she was attacked and sunk by a Japanese submarine. So, what's so special about this story? Um, they, the ship sent signals to the Navy, distress signals, but the Navy claimed that they never received them. The, this delay sort of led to the loss of hundreds of soldiers. While 300 men died on the ship, another 880 just sort of floated around the ocean for 4 days. They suffered from lack of food, water, exposure to the elements, severe desquamation, which is the effect that salt water has. And also, the big thing is shark attacks. There was a episode during Shark Week that sort of discusses this event. Um, this was probably the single most shark attacks in history. Many of the sailors who were in the water were eaten by sharks. Um, if you weren't already uh, dead, there was a good chance you would have been eaten by a shark. And amongst all of this, the Japanese military refuses to surrender. If you remember from the video from yesterday, the the Japanese military was pretty demoralized, and but they didn't want to surrender. They refused to give up, and they would fight by any means necessary. They would um, kill their own people. They would use kamikazes. They were not willing to give up. A month after, or a month before the defeat of Germany, President Roosevelt dies, and Harry Truman becomes the president. And with that, he has been given some tough decisions to make. During this time, the Manhattan Project is being completed. Remember, the Manhattan Project was the project to create the atomic bomb. Truman was forced to consider three options. First is to invade Japan. This would not go well, based off of soldiers' experiences in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They realized that this army will fight to the death, and that's not necessarily something the American military is okay with. The next option is to drop the atomic bomb, but in the Pacific, away from the people, but sort of as a demonstration of the American military strength. And then the last is to drop the bomb without warning and essentially shock Japan into surrendering. His decision is to drop it without warning. The plane that dropped one of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima So August 6th, 1945 is the bombing of Hiroshima. 80 to 120,000 people die instantly. 3 days later is the bombing of Nagasaki, where 70,000 die instantly. Thousands more are affected by radiation with birth defects. Some of them got cancer, things like that. These are pictures of the cities before the atomic bomb and then after. some of the effects of exposure to the radiation would have on your body. This man actually survived both Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks during World War II. Pretty insane story. This is a picture of a atomic bomb survivor. Obviously, he had some um, injuries as a result. One of the interesting aspects of the atomic bomb explosion were these atomic shadows. And the shadows were basically believed to be an outline of a person that more than likely was sort of disintegrated or incinerated as the bomb went off. The same day as the bombing on Nagasaki, the Soviets also invade Japan, and Emperor Hirohito orders his government to surrender. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan officially surrenders. He surrenders to General MacArthur above the USS Missouri. So, what are the effects of World War II on not just Japan, but the world? Obviously, it leaves Europe and Japan in ruins. But it leads to the creation of the United Nations. First, the United Nations was comprised of 50 countries. Now, it's made up of nearly 200, and its purpose is to be a international peacekeeping organization. And the idea is that they can settle various disputes without having to resort to going to war. This is the UN building in New York. The changes in Japan, the emperor loses his power and sort of just becomes like a figurehead, almost like Queen Elizabeth in England. She doesn't really do much. Japan becomes a democracy. They model their constitution after the United States. They create a Bill of Rights that guarantees freedoms. The women have the right to vote. They draft up a constitution that says Japan can attack another country. And 1951, they sign a peace treaty with the United States, and the U.S. occupation ends. And U.S. and Japan have become allies, which they have been ever since. you look at this graphic, World War II was probably the most destructive war in history. More as is usually the case, a lot of civilians die during any war, but during World War II, um, more civilians than soldiers died in the war, which is sort of like a staggering number. And if you look at the chart on the left, you can see it's pretty astounding how many civilians were killed during the war. And that is it. Make sure you answer the questions. Have a good weekend.